My name is Christopher Renstrom, and I'm your weekly horoscope columnist here on Astrology Hub. And this week, I wanted to talk to you about the Venus-Saturn conjunction in Aquarius on March 28th. Now, this week, I'm going to ask you to indulge me a little bit. I'm going to say right off the bat that this week's horoscope is not going to be about a prediction, but rather what I wanted to do instead was to sort of do a talk or an unpacking of what it is to have Venus conjunct Saturn in Aquarius, either natally in your chart or by transit. The way that I like to work with Venus is Venus to me is the planet of attraction. It's the planet of what I like in your astrological chart, but Venus also talks about what you're going to be attracting into your life. And that sort of personality or that sort of energy that you attract into your life will be described by the sign that Venus is in or the planets that she is forming some kind of aspect to. Now, Venus-Saturn conjunctions have a bit of a negative reputation in astrology. In a natal chart, a Venus-Saturn conjunction, particularly in a Saturn-ruled sign like Aquarius, is supposed to be cold and loveless. And if it's not cold and loveless, then it means you're going to be, if you're a woman, you're going to be married off to a much older man who's going to prize you for your dowry and your money and your estate. You will, in essence, be his love slave or marriage slave or something along those lines. I mean, the way the books go on, I think also frigidity is thrown in there and icy temperament and a contempt towards love and a contempt towards people. I mean, sometimes what's kind of fun about these old astrology books is that when they really get going, it really gets dark and dreary. It's hysterically funny. So, so basically, you know, one of the great notorious signatures in a chart is a Venus-Saturn conjunction, especially Venus conjunct Saturn in a Saturn-ruled sign like Capricorn or Aquarius. Why? Because it brings out the Saturnian qualities, the Saturnian qualities of control and icy demeanor and remoteness and aloofness and a sort of impassive cruelty, those sorts of things. So what I was put in mind of when I wanted to talk to you this week about the Venus-Saturn conjunction was I was trying to think, what would make a really good example of a Venus-Saturn conjunction? What sort of story would kind of illustrate it? And with Venus in particular, I like to look in literature and art and literature to find examples of Venus because, well, first of all, Venus rules over art and literature, but also, you know, in terms of the romantic stories that we tell ourselves. As you've watched previously, you know I'm a huge fan of rom-coms, particularly Korean rom-coms. But, you know, romantic comedy tells us a lot about Venus. And you could learn all sorts of things by watching romantic comedy from different genres and romantic comedy from different countries to really learn how Venus operates in our life. So the story that came to mind for me is the story of Pride and Prejudice, which was written by Jane Austen. And I wanted to use Pride and Prejudice as an example of a Venus-Saturn conjunction in Aquarius, because in some of the lines I'm going to be sharing with you, you can really hear those planets and that sign coming through so powerfully. Okay, so Venus, as I said, is going to be the planet of attraction. It's going to draw what I like into my life. And so if you've got Venus in Aquarius, you're going to draw or attract into your life the Aquarian type of temperament. Okay, now, one of the big misconceptions I feel that people have about Venus in Aquarius is that the automatic assumption is that Venus in Aquarius is, some sort of like hippy dippy, sleeps around, can't commit to one type of person, type of woman or man. And remember that Venus in a horoscope can refer, it's the planet of what I attract. So this can be what you attract regardless of your gender. And so there's this idea of like, Venus in Aquarius is like, I don't know, some sort of like cliche of a Swedish woman from the 1960s. I don't know. It just just, and where it's like, oh, I just want to explore sexuality, but I'm cold and aloof. And I'm like, anyway, all those sorts of things. Anyway, that is not what Venus in Aquarius is. Venus in Aquarius draws the Aquarian temperament into your life if you have Venus in Aquarius. And the Aquarian temperament is going to be a very aloof temperament. It's going to be a very intellectual temperament. And it's not going to be really emotionally accessible. And you can expect to have to deal with a lot of this person's friends. Okay, Venus changes, as you might imagine, of course, from sign to sign. But Venus, for instance, let's take the other two air signs, like Gemini or Libra. Venus in Gemini or Venus in Libra can be very one-on-one. And it's more about partnering, or it's more about the friend or the best buddy. There's an intimacy to a Venus in either Gemini or Libra. But when you put Venus in Aquarius, you're dealing with a group of people. Okay, so if you have Venus in Aquarius, the people that you socialize with are almost as important as the person you may want to partner with. In fact, a lot of times you may meet your partner, if you have Venus in Aquarius, through your clique, your friends, the people that you're socializing with. And it may sort of like not dawn on you immediately that the person might be interested in you. Okay, Venus in Aquarius can be, and I get to say this because I have Venus in Aquarius. Okay, I'll just make Venus in Aquarius can be a little slow on the uptake as to when someone is interested in them romantically. Okay, it can sort of like take a little while for them to sort of figure that out, because you're hanging out with the same group of people, you're fraternizing with the same group of colleagues or friends or peers, wherever you socialize. And so, you don't really recognize when someone's making their intentions or their romantic intentions known, because romantic intentions can have a tendency to be more exclusionary. We're going to like pair off and maybe take a stroll in the garden, or we're going to pair off and go on a date or something like that. And Venus in Aquarius can often get a little bit bent out of shape with like, well, what's this going to do with all the people that we're hanging out with? This is going to like change the group dynamic. This is going to upset the way that, and so there's lots of discussion as to the impact this is going to have on the people and this is kind of a Venus in Aquarius thing. They're always very acutely aware, not really of what other people think of them, because Venus in Aquarius has all those Aquarian attributes as well, of kind of feeling like I fit in, I don't fit in. And actually, it's really more along the lines of like, I don't fit in. I mean, one of the great ironies to understanding Aquarius as a sign is that for all of its socializing, and Aquarius is a tremendously, Sun in Aquarius, Moon in Aquarius, Venus in Aquarius, it's a tremendously social sign, but they never feel like they belong in the group that they're socializing in. There's always a sense of being an outcast in some way, or misunderstood in some way, or, just sort of observing things from the sidelines, never really getting very Libra or very Gemini. Libra and Geminis are the ones who jump on into the pool and they're making friends and flirting and all these sorts of things. Aquarius of the three air signs feels the most sort of like, even if I'm surrounded by people, who really get me, or I'm admired, for skills or my intellect or something like that, there's still a sense of not really belonging. And that's something that often haunts or stays in the background of the Aquarian horoscope. So with Venus in Aquarius, you know, being a part of a group is a big deal. What people think is a big deal, but also the contradiction of going against what people think or going against what people expect is also woven into the Venus in Aquarius. So I really sort of want you to hold that in mind. There is a true contradiction there. It's I socialize with people and my social connections and associations matter a lot, but at the same time, you know, I don't feel like I'm really a part of them. I'm not going to follow lockstep. I'm not going to do what everyone else does. And it's not always by choice. There's a feeling of just maybe bad timing or not getting things or whatever that makes them sort of like apart, even though they're involved in the group. So here we have the Venus in Aquarius. And I kind of want you to think, let's just take, for the sake of making it simple, let's take Elizabeth Bennet as the Venus in Aquarius, okay, sort of character in this conjunction. And then, of course, we're going to take Mr. Darcy. We're going to take Mr. Darcy as the Saturn in Aquarius. What's interesting here is that, you know, think for a moment of a Venus-Saturn conjunction, okay? A conjunction between two planets is not a fusion of the planets. They don't lose themselves in each other. I want you to always sort of think of a conjunction of the planets. And a conjunction, by the way, is when two planets are in the same place in the sky at the same time. If you're thinking of hands on the face of a clock, a conjunction would be 12 noon. You know, how do I do this? The two hands are right at the same point, pointing up to 12. That would be like a conjunction. Okay, two planets are in the same place at the same time. So when you have a Venus-Saturn conjunction in Aquarius, I want you to think of these two planets as kind of like tied together to each other in a three-legged race. All right, so three-legged race is an image that I'd like to really use with a conjunction. The planets are tied to each other and they have to like run this race. But you know, what if one's tall and the other one's short? What if one's plump and the other one's thin? What if the other one's, you know, fast and the other one's fast and the other one is slow? You know, conjunctions between planets, they sort of like have to work out how they're going to operate with one another. Like for instance, okay, let's take a really easy breezy conjunction, a conjunction between Mercury and Venus, especially in an air sign or a fire sign. They really get each other and they're bubbly and they're social, and that conjunction is just like really wonderful. But let's say you throw in a conjunction between Mars and Venus. Well, Venus wants peace and Mars wants a conflict. So that can get very difficult, but also passionate. Okay, but they're going to have Venus and Mars doing a three-legged race are going to have a very different idea about how you run this race than a Venus and a Mercury, for instance. Okay, so here we have a Venus and a Saturn conjunction in Aquarius. So we also add to the fact that not all conjunctions are the same. If we have a Venus and Saturn conjunction in Aquarius, that means Saturn rules the conjunction. Okay, so already Venus is not on equal footing with Saturn because Saturn rules the conjunction. So this relationship, whatever relationship takes place underneath the auspices or the beams of a Saturn-Venus conjunction is going to be dictated by Saturn. So what that means is that it's going to be very slow. It's going to be very cool. It's going to be very cautious, and it's going to bring out in the two people their fear of rejection, their fear of being humiliated. Because we're dealing with Aquarius, we're also going to be dealing with, to some degree, a fear of the loss of status. Now, some of you might be like, fear of the loss of status, why would you know, Aquarius be so stuffy about such a thing? Aquarians, believe it or not, are very status conscious. Okay, again, one of the great misunderstandings about Aquarius, about sort of letting it all hang out and going with whatever. This all comes from 1968. Okay, the origin of all of this comes from 1968 when the musical Hair came out. And so there was that famous number, Age of Aquarius, when the moon is in the 7th house, etc. And everyone thought Aquarius was the hippy dippy sign. Please, Aquarius is not a hippy-dippy sign. Aquarius is ruled by the planet Saturn, okay? There's nothing remotely hippy-dippy about Aquarius, although there are other aspects that come into Aquarius that are of great interest, which we will discover when we talk a little bit more about Mr. Darcy. So because Saturn rules the conjunction with Venus in Aquarius, there is going to be a pact or a pledge. Venus rules over betrothals, pacts, pledges. There's going to be a pact or a pledge, which is going to come to a conclusion, which is going to be finalized. Okay, so when you have a Saturn-Venus conjunction like this, you seal the deal, you sign the contract, you agree to the pact, you enter into a contract. So in other words, it's going to play out in marriage, or it's going to play out in some sort of business partnership, because the Saturn ruling the conjunction brings a kind of certainty to it. All right, so let's do a quick rundown of Pride and Prejudice, because all of this that I'm going to talk about today hinges on one very important scene, one scene in which I really want you to sort of hear the Venus and Saturn conjunction that's taking place. Pride and Prejudice, Pride and Prejudice, Pride and Prejudice, Pride and Prejudice. Pride and Prejudice. Okay, Pride and Prejudice is one of my favorite books. I absolutely adore this book. I always like read and reread this book and get so many things out of it. And I strongly recommend it, especially if you had to read it in college or high school. Come back and read it when you're older. You're really, really going to enjoy it. Okay, so Pride and Prejudice is basically the story of Elizabeth Bennet. She's the second oldest of 5 daughters who are sort of like launched at the same time in terms of their debut in public. It takes place in the early 1800s. And so, you know, the mother wants to marry them all off or whatever. I don't know whether it's a joke or a claim or whatever, but this isn't what you did. When you had a daughter who was going to marry, you did a debut one after another, after another, after another. And so really Mrs. Bennet sort of releases them all like, you know, skipping puppies at the beginning of the book. And they all show up at this like ball, this party, and they live in the country, and they're country folk. And there's a party that's being given in the month of October. What's fascinating is that Pride and Prejudice takes place in a year and following the seasons as you follow the story. So the girls all attend this party along with the rest of the village or whatever that's being given by Bingley, who is this like lord, this foppy kind of fellow. Well, he's more a pretty boy than he is a foppy kind of fellow. Anyway, he's a gentleman of means, and there's this party, and he's attending it, and so he's attending it. He's very handsome, and he's a very likable sort of fellow. And what's wonderful about Pride and Prejudice beginning in October is that it begins in the month of Libra. Okay, so it begins in the month that is ruled by Venus. Okay, so Elizabeth, we're going to focus pretty much on Elizabeth and her older sister Jane. Jane is the oldest, and Jane is the sweetest, and Jane is the prettiest. Jane is very Libra, in my opinion. Okay, so whenever Jane smiles, men smile back, you know, and Jane just has this way of just sort of looking off in a direction, and people, you know, actually maybe she's a Leo, but, you know, people sort of like try to catch Jane's eye and smile back. You know, there's just something so wonderful and so calming and so soothing and so lovely about Jane. She just expresses this beautiful Venusian quality. And so she's at this party, and Elizabeth, who's Jane's sister, goes to the party. Now, Elizabeth is a little bit more, well, honestly, Saturnine, or maybe Mercurial, but I think there's a bit of a Saturnine quality to her as well. She's got a wit, and she's very, very smart. And Elizabeth is 21. She's 21 when she goes to this party. And so everyone's dancing with everyone, and they're having a wonderful time. And Elizabeth, actually, maybe she's more Saturn than Mercury, because she's socializing, but not socializing too much. And actually, she's kind of a little standoffish. at this ball, at this dance. And it's not a big ball. It's like, it's filling a house. So it's a dance. It would be sort of like a dorm dance or whatever nowadays. Okay. But it's in a house. Okay. And it's nice and they're wearing finery. Okay. So, but she's a little bit standoffish or whatever. And Darcy is best friends with Bingley, who is like throwing this party. And Darcy is 28. And this is really important because Darcy's 28 and Elizabeth is 21. And if you're an astrologer, you're going to recognize right off the bat that Darcy is in a Saturn return, okay, 28. And Elizabeth, 21, is at a time in her life where Saturn is aspecting Saturn in her own natal chart. If you remember Saturn, Saturn will square, oppose, square again, every 7 years of your life. Okay, that's why the ages of 7, 14, and 21 are so significant in people's lives, especially if you have Saturn strong, because these are the years where you come up against some sort of like test or some sort of challenge in your life. But there's a Saturn imprint to 7, 14, 21. Elizabeth is 21. Darcy is 28, so he's starting a Saturn return. And of course, if you do the math, you quickly discover that there was a 7-year age difference between Elizabeth and Darcy. And 7-year age difference, that's Saturn right off the bat. Saturn rules over 7-year cycles, and Saturn rules over 7-year age differences. And you'll see a lot of coupling if Saturn is very strong, especially in a Saturn-Venus type of aspect, where the age difference is 7 years and sometimes 14 years. And I've even seen 18 to 21. Okay, so there is an age difference. So that idea of like age difference, Saturn and Venus conjoined, that part from the old astrology actually works. Okay, that does show up in Venus-Saturn conjunctions. Okay, so Elizabeth is 21 and Darcy is 28. And Bingley is kind of the male version of Jane, Elizabeth's older sister. You know, he's very handsome and he's very likable, and he's not the brightest bulb on the tree. Okay, like people have a tendency to fall in love with Bingley. You know, he's so well dressed and fashionable, and Bingley, being the very accommodating and lovely person that he is, has a tendency to fall in love with them back. Okay, and so this is why Darcy, who is much, taller, more cool, more austere, you kind of get a feeling that he's darker, maybe in complexion and feeling. This is why Darcy, who's Bingley's best friend, looks after Bingley's concerns. He's kind of like Bingley's nun who keeps showing up and breaking him up from all the fangirls who want to go out with him, or not nun, maybe I should say personal handler. Okay, but anyway, Darcy isn't any more comfortable at this kind of like festival or ball, this dance, than Elizabeth is. And so Elizabeth is kind of hanging out, and Darcy is like, being, he's immediately described as being very snobbish, very, very full of himself, and so he's chatting with the other gentlemen. They're like, well, why don't you, Mr. Darcy, why don't you invite one of these lovely country women, ladies or whatever, to dance? They're all having a wonderful time. Look at your friend Bingley. He's dancing with Jane Bennet. They seem to be having a great deal of fun. And indeed, Bingley and Elizabeth's older sister, Jane, are getting on like a house on fire. They're dancing and having a great time. And so Darcy's like, no, I'm not interested in asking one of these women who aren't dancing. I don't basically, want seconds. I mean, it's basically what he's saying. So he's looking at all the women who are like not dancing, and he's like, well, I'm not going to ask one of them to dance because obviously they're not that popular and they're kind of like seconds, and I'm not going to embarrass myself by stooping so low, And they're like, well, what about that woman who's standing there behind you? And it happens to be, of course, Elizabeth Bennet, who's the protagonist of the novel. And he looks her up and down and he says, well, she's tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me. Take that in for a moment. She's tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me. Well, of course, Elizabeth overhears it. This Jane Austen novel. I love Jane Austen novels. Okay. Elizabeth, of course, overhears it. Okay. And she's like, just like astonished, okay, that anyone would say anything like that to her, and immediately makes up, decides on the spot that he's the most snotty, arrogant person she's ever met, and he's just an awful, awful, awful human being. Okay, fast forward through the novel. So obviously that's their first encounter. And because Darcy's out there babysitting Bingley, who's fallen in love with Jane. Okay, like he's absolutely fallen in love with Jane. He's kind of playing the babysitter with Bingley, and he's making sure that this crush doesn't go anywhere, because again, Bingley has a lot of money and Jane Bennet does not. Okay, Elizabeth Bennet does not. Their family, they're not poor, but they're middling. They're not doing so well. They have enough, but they're not doing so well. But the other thing, and this is very important to Pride and Prejudice, is that they're all daughters. They don't have sons. So the daughters have to marry. Okay, this is why Mrs. Bennet is being stage mom with all of her daughters. She's pushing them all into marriage. The daughters have to marry, because if they don't, they're going to lose their what money they do have, which has been passed down through Mr. Bennet's family. That money will go to a male heir. So because Mrs. Bennet did not produce a son, she did not produce a male heir, it's going to go to a cousin of the Bennets. Okay, so basically all 5 girls are faced with the prospects of being penniless if they don't marry. So this is something that, we don't really sort of appreciate nowadays, but this is an enormous thing back at the time that this novel was written, which is in the early 1800s. So this is an enormous thing that if a woman doesn't do well in terms of marriage, she's not only a burden to her family, but there are like no financial prospects moving forward. So the fact that Mrs. Bennet has announced all of her daughters are open to the market for marriage and is joking about it and is pushing them all, it's making her look very tacky. Okay, it's making her look very much like she's pushing her daughters on gentlemen of status, gentlemen who have money. And this is what Darcy has immediately decided about the entire Bennet family. All right, and so he's they're beneath him, and then when he sees one of them, the oldest, making eyes at his best friend, he's like, okay, that's someone who's looking for a love match. Okay, so I have to protect my friend because he falls in love with everybody and everybody falls in love with him. And so he's very guarded. He's kind of like a guard dog around Bingley. And so he's protecting him. But because this is, I don't know, early 1800s England or whatever, and it's a Jane Austen novel, okay, everyone keeps crossing paths with everyone else. It's a village, they go to a city, they come back to the village, whatever. You cross paths with people that you know. And the people whom you want to cross paths with are the people who are in your society. Okay, if you're a worker, it's other workers. If you're a person of means, it's other people of means. Okay, so you socialize with your class. And England at this period is very stratified. It's very defined in its social class. And so people with money are always on the lookout for those who don't have it, who are trying to like social climb, one of the great cardinal sins of this period. But nevertheless, Jane has responded to Bingley's requests, but at the same time, I think it's like a couple of weeks after the dance or whatever, when they meet, Darcy hustles Bingley off to London and gets rid of him. And so he's making sure that Bingley and Jane have nothing to do with each other. But nevertheless, he's socializing because he knows people in the country and things like that. And for various different reasons and purposes, Elizabeth and Darcy's paths cross and keep crossing over a period of time. And what's going on here as they cross over this period of time is that they're finding themselves in different situations where they're having conversations with one another. And indeed, the women of Darcy's class are trying to steer him away from Elizabeth. And, convenience or coincidence being what it is in novels like this, Elizabeth always finds herself in a situation where she's talking to Darcy. And you get from their exchanges that they're very much of the same mind, that they're intellectually well matched, that they converse, and they're kind of enjoying one another's company. But as they're beginning to sort of enjoy one another's company, Elizabeth becomes friends with someone who, his name's Wickham. He's no good. Okay. Wickham, who was a ward of Darcy's father. Darcy lives on this immense mansion called Pemberley and has like all of this money, and it's absolutely gorgeous. And Pemberley is like actually out around here somewhere in England. Oh my God, my geography of England, bad. Okay. But anyway, Pemberley's sort of out here somewhere in the country. And so Pemberley's magnificent. It's this gorgeous, gorgeous estate. But Wickham was kind of like the son of the father's personal dresser or companion, or someone who, walked the grounds with Darcy's father and took care of things, kind of like a handyman or something like that. And so Darcy's father has always been very benevolent to Wickham. Wickham isn't born of wealth or status, but Darcy's father was very fond of Wickham's father. And so, made allowances to take care of Wickham in his will, and Wickham has found out about this. But Darcy has cut Wickham off. Okay. And so Wickham, who's a soldier, he's a British soldier who's going to go and fight in the Napoleonic Wars. Wickham, becomes friends and kind of flirty with Elizabeth a little bit, and tells Elizabeth his sad story of woe. Okay. And it's a sad story of woe of how Darcy, he was raised with Darcy as a brother, and Darcy cut him off, and he's just a miserable human being, and he's not to be trusted. And so she's alarmed, and she's like, well, that plays into everything I know about him. He's so snotty and full of himself. And yes, and then also during these different conversations in Jane Austen, they're always having conversations like in parlors and on walks and strolls and things like that. I actually have no idea what these women do with themselves during the day, but they seem to have like lots of conversations where they walk and stroll. Okay. So anyway, on another conversation, she finds out that, Jane, her sister, who has fallen in love with Bingley and keeps hoping to hear from him, well, Bingley was actually whisked away by Darcy, and that Darcy broke up whatever was the beginning of a love relationship or courting that's going on between Bingley and Elizabeth's sister Jane. And so she finds that out. And so it's like, Darcy, I mean, like, what starts churning in Elizabeth's mind is like, Darcy is this person who cuts people off from his will and full of his money and his snobbery, and he's the person who busted up the love affair with my sister Jane, and Jane has fallen in love with Bingley. I mean, Jane is one of those people who loves, and she loves very openly and very innocently, and she's been hurt by Bingley's silence over the weeks and now the months since they have met. She was led to believe that he liked her and things like that. So here I just want to, so here we have a scene. This is all setting up the scene. So here we have this scene where Elizabeth has found out, from Darcy's cousin that Darcy was actually boasting. Darcy's cousin reports that Darcy was boasting that he broke up that affair between Bingley and Jane, that actually Bingley was very interested in Jane, but he broke it up, and according to Darcy's cousin, he's laughing about it. So people are really not reporting nice things about Darcy. Okay. But nevertheless, Darcy has been a walking companion with Elizabeth, and they've shared conversation and things like that. But she's learned that he's behind their not seeing each other. She's learned that he's behind Jane's broken heart, and that Wickham has also, been cheated by Darcy. So after this conversation is ended, these people have left the drawing room. It says here, when they were gone, Elizabeth, as if intending to exasperate herself as much as possible against Mr. Darcy, chose for her employment the examination of all the letters which Jane had written to her since being in Kent. Okay, so she's like, he's a horrible person, and so she's going to go and she's going to read all these letters that Jane has written to her. Now, the letters themselves contained no actual complaint, nor was there any revival of past occurrences or any communication of present suffering. But in all, and in almost every line of each, there was a want of that cheerfulness which had been used to characterize Jane's style, and which, proceeding from the serenity of a mind at ease with itself and kindly disposed to everyone, had been scarcely ever clouded. So in other words, Elizabeth goes searching through these letters that Jane has written. You have to remember, back in Jane Austen's time, they didn't have texting and they didn't really have email. So they actually sat down and they wrote long letters to each other, and they collected them. They held on to them, just like you hold on to voicemails in your message box or something like that. And you go back over them. You read over the chain of emails. This is what they're doing. This is what Jane's doing. She's reading over these letters that Jane has sent her from somewhere else, like in another house where she's staying. But she's decided that these letters don't really sound like Jane. Jane is a very open and effusive person, but there's something about them. And so, and this is what I love that Jane Austen writes. Elizabeth noticed, she's reading Jane's letters, Elizabeth noticed every sentence conveying the idea of uneasiness. Okay, so she's seeing uneasiness in every single line of these letters. Elizabeth noticed every sentence conveying the idea of uneasiness with an attention which it had hardly received on first perusal. So in other words, what had been benign letters talking about her day or whatever, Elizabeth, because she's decided that Jane is hurting from having been forced into a breakup, is now seeing uneasiness and now sees the distress that Jane has been under, that Jane's been covering up her feelings of sorrow, when in fact Jane just wrote Elizabeth letters about a sort of, general sadness about things not working out with Bingley, actually despondency, but Jane has now taken it upon herself to fight on Elizabeth. Elizabeth has now taken it upon herself to fight on Jane's behalf. And again, this is very Venus in Aquarius, all right? It's taking on the other person's cause. Putting aside, whatever your own feelings are, you're taking on the other person's cause, and you've decided that this person has been wronged in some way, and so you're going to come to their defense. You're going to advocate for them. So whatever Elizabeth's feelings are about Darcy, we don't know, because they're all being told through Elizabeth taking on the lost causes or the underdog causes of Jane, who was forced to break up with Bingley, and with Wickham, who has been treated horribly by Mr. Darcy. Okay, so she's full of fire and fury, rage and fury. Okay, at Darcy, the villain. All right, so it's at this moment. It's at this moment when Jane is going through the letter, when Elizabeth is, sorry, I get confused. When Elizabeth is at this moment when Elizabeth is basically scrolling through the letters that Jane has written, and getting herself really angry at Darcy, that Mr. Darcy shows up. Okay, but Mr. Darcy doesn't show up like an eager Labrador retriever. Mr. Darcy shows up in his sort of droll, standoffish, austere way. Although in this regard, he's showing up, he's actually a little bit more poised than he usually is. I mean, Elizabeth and Darcy have gotten into a point where they sort of not quite punch each other in the arm, but where they're friendly with each other. But this time he's a little bit more, straight-backed. He's a little bit more poised than he would usually be. And so he enters, and Elizabeth is actually genuinely surprised to see him. And this is basically the worst time that Darcy could be possibly showing up. And so Darcy says to her, "In vain have I struggled. It will not do. My feelings will not be repressed. You must allow me to tell you how ardently I admire and love you." Okay. This is the last thing Elizabeth was expecting, that Darcy has shown up to profess his love to her. Darcy of the tolerable but not handsome enough to tempt me persuasion, okay, has shown up after weeks of socializing to declare his love to her. It's actually months of socializing to declare his love to her. And what's fascinating about this is that this declaration of love that Darcy makes is in the month of April. It is exactly 6 months away, 6 months after when they met. And so it is the month of April, which is ruled by Mars, okay, not Venus, okay? It's the opposite of Venus. In other words, if you're starting something in October, you don't want to be declaring your affections when the sun is opposite from where you began, okay? Because that is the weakest point that it could possibly be. All right, so in vain if I struggled, my feelings won't be repressed. I want to allow me to tell you how ardently I admire and love you. Okay, and Jane Austen writes, Elizabeth's astonishment was beyond expression. She stared, colored, doubted, and was silent. I love that. She stared, colored, blushed, doubted, and was silent. It gets worse. Okay, Darcy considers to be a good thing. Okay, and Austen writes, this he considered sufficient encouragement. Okay, so Darcy interprets this silence as sufficient encouragement. And the avowal of all that he felt and had long felt for her immediately followed. Okay, so he starts to tell her about his love for her, like her silence, he's like, oh, how modest. And now I'm going to tell her all these things I feel about her. But Austen points out, but there were feelings besides those of the heart to be detailed. And he was not more eloquent on the subject of tenderness than of pride. And in other words, he's talking about his tenderness, but there's still this pride that's coming through. Pride in the context that Jane Austen is using it is snobbery, snobbishness, okay? So it's not pride like, or it's pride like looking down the nose, condescension, okay, would be a good way for us to think of it nowadays. He was not more eloquent on the subject of tenderness than of pride. His sense, this is Jane Austen reporting the conversation, his sense of her inferiority, of its being a degradation, of the family obstacles which judgment had always opposed to inclination, were dwelt on with a warmth which seemed due to the consequence he was wounding, but was very unlikely to recommend his suit. This is an important line. His sense of her inferiority, he's talking about her inferiority right to her face, okay? Of it being a degradation to him. Of the family obstacles which judgment had always opposed to inclination. In other words, don't act on your feelings, Darcy. There are obstacles that you're going to confront dealing with social, with your society, your social class being appalled at what you're doing. So he's talking about her inferiority of it being degradation for him to even propose this. And he goes on about this with a warmth which seemed due to the consequence he was wounding. Okay, we're dwelt on with a warmth which seemed due to the consequence he was wounding. Consequence in this sentence refers to, okay, we talk about a person of consequence, right? We mean a person of consequence, a person of means, a person of wealth. Okay, so here he is dwelling on a warmth which seemed due to the consequence he was wounding. He was wounding his own means, okay, by talking to her. He's saying this to her face, okay, but was very unlikely to recommend his suit. So in other words, he knows that proposing to her, he's risking not social ostracization, far from it, but social censure, social looking down the nose. And what he wants her to know is that this is heroic. Okay, I mean, like, this is so Saturn and Aquarius to me. Okay, so it's the kind of thing of like, Aquarius has a tendency to narrate too much what is going on mentally with it. Okay, and so you have to imagine that for a man of tremendous wealth to even consider marrying someone who is beneath his station, okay, is seen as an embarrassment. Okay, and that he wants her to see this as how heroic he is. He's basically saying to her, Elizabeth, And he's talking about his feelings. I love and admire you ardently. And I also want you to know that for a man of my means, what a noble sacrifice I'm making to stoop to your level, to ask you for your hand in marriage. Aren't I wonderful? Like, shouldn't you celebrate this? Isn't this noble of me? Okay, this is what's coming out in this interview. And then he concluded with representing to her the strength of that attachment, which, in spite of all of his endeavors, he had found impossible to conquer, and with expressing his hope that it would now be rewarded by her acceptance of his hand. Okay, so I have these feelings, I couldn't conquer them, I'm humbling myself socially to ask your hand in marriage, and with this enormous sacrifice, I'm hoping that you will now reward me by accepting my hand. Okay. As he said this, she, Elizabeth, could easily see that he had no doubt of a favorable answer. Okay, so this is no great sacrifice. He didn't doubt that she was going to say yes. He spoke, and this is in the text, he spoke of apprehension and anxiety, but his countenance expressed real security. So in other words, he talks about anxiety and apprehension, but he knows, of course, she's going to say yes. When he ceased, I love this scene so much. When he ceased, she said, this is Elizabeth, in such cases as this, it is, I believe, the established mode to express a sense of obligation for the sentiments avowed, however unequally they may be returned. It is natural that obligation should be felt, and if I could feel gratitude, I would now thank you, but I cannot. So she begins with, in cases like this, where you confess, where you talk about your true feelings out of a sense of obligation, you're to avow or be agreeable. And it's natural that this obligation, I don't want you to feel embarrassed or something like that, would be something that I would do if I could feel gratitude. Okay, obligation hinges on gratitude. If I could feel gratitude, I would now thank you, for this tremendous show of humility and asking for my hand in marriage. But I cannot thank you for this, okay? She goes on, I have never desired your good opinion, and you have certainly bestowed it most unwillingly. She's referring to the great, struggle within Darcy's soul between his feelings for Elizabeth and losing face in his social station. I mean, I just love the way she, with that. I've never desired your good opinion, and you have certainly bestowed it most unwillingly. You bestowed your good opinion with great conflict within yourself. I am sorry to have occasioned pain to anyone. It has been more unconsciously done, however, and I hope that it will be of short duration. Okay, I'm sorry to cause you pain and disappointment. I didn't mean to, and I hope that your pain will be of short duration. The feelings which, you tell me, have long prevented the acknowledgement of your regard can have little difficulty in overcoming it after this explanation. So in other words, I'm sure that having been at war with your feelings was a struggle, but I'm sure that your pride, in your social status will ultimately win over whatever emotional turmoil you might have gone through on my behalf. It is so, bitchy. Okay, so Mr. Darcy, who was leaning against the mantelpiece with his eyes fixed on her face, seemed to catch her words with no less resentment than surprise. At length, in a voice of forced calmness, he said, because he's just poured out his soul to her as far as he's concerned, he said, and this is all the reply which I am to have the honor of expecting? I might perhaps wish to be informed why, with so little endeavor at civility, I am thus rejected. but it is of small importance. What he's doing is that the Saturn walls are closing down. Like he's been rejected, and now the deflector shields are going up. The walls are closing down. But Elizabeth doesn't leave it there. She continues, "I might as well inquire," said she, "why with so evident a design of offending and insulting me, you chose to tell me that you liked me against your will, against your reason, and even against your character. Was not this some excuse for incivility if I was uncivil?" Think about this. Why was so evident a design of offending and insulting me? In other words, you came out with your true feelings for me, but at the same time you insulted me. You know, you told me that you had these very strong feelings that you have for me, but at the same time you were telling me that that I am beneath you, that I am fortunate, that you are looking down upon me, that you're going to ask my hand in marriage. And was this really a narration of this conflict that you're fighting inside of yourself, or was this really a preemptive strike? Okay. And this is the beauty of a Venus-Saturn conjunction. There is a truth to these conjunctions in which both parties have to fess up to. Okay, it's almost like they have this, this instant understanding of what's going on underneath. And the instant understanding is based on a fear of rejection. Elizabeth has a fear of rejection just as much, just as powerfully, and just as ardently as Mr. Darcy does. And so what she's saying is like, you're telling me that I should be moved by this struggle between your station and your feelings, but did you perhaps go on about, and you made such a list. I mean, Jane Austen describes him making such a list of why it's a bad idea that he should be in love with Elizabeth. Did you, tell me these things, which were incivil, if you think about it? They were insulting. Were you doing this to get the first strike in case I rejected you? Were you being aggressive in your telling me the reasons why you shouldn't be falling in love with me? And was that, a show of nobility on your part, or was that you softening the blow should I reject you? Okay. And it's an extraordinary insight. I mean, think of different relationships or associations that you've had with people where you have feared rejection, or where people have had with you where they have feared rejection, how they may lead with the insult or with the cynical or the sarcastic comment, maybe even the biting statement. And they're doing it because they're actually protecting themselves from what they are afraid of you being, that you may reject what their feelings are. How many times in a fight do we kind of lead that way? We'll say, this is what I feel, but then I'm now going to narrate what I think your thinking is. Okay, I'm going to now narrate what I think your thinking is, and you're taking the words out of the person's mouth that you're fighting with, and you're it's almost like you're claiming that territory before the person you're fighting with can claim it. Okay, this is what Elizabeth is invoking. This is what she's talking about. Was this really a great show of your affections? Or were you, trying to have it both ways? Show your affections, but in case I rejected you, made yourself feel okay about that because I'm beneath your station and what was to be expected anyway. So she has him on this. And he knows it, but she doesn't stay there. She goes on, she says, but I have other provocations, I have. And so what she goes into is this list of all the reasons why she would never have accepted his proposal, how he broke up, the beginning of a relationship between her sister and his best friend, and his dastardly dealings with Wickham. And so he hears all of this. And as he hears all of this, he grows more and more expressionless and more like, focused. He's gone into himself. He's gone into his thoughts, Aquarius. He's gone into his intellect place, to reason out, And so she goes through this exhaustive list. And And we're going to find out in the next scene that this is all based on misunderstandings that she has had about him, that she has been fed false information by people, and more particularly by Wickham. But nevertheless, she goes into all of this and she's angry at all of this, and she's speaking from a place of justice, of how could you be so heartless, towards, like, why would you think that I wouldn't have feelings for my sister and come to her defense? How could you be so heartless towards this ward given over to your financial responsibility? She doesn't know that Wickham is a player, but Darcy does. And so Darcy hears all of this and he takes it, which is also an extraordinary part. He doesn't come to his defense right away. He actually hears it all. And when she's finished, and he knows the truth, and he knows that she doesn't know the truth. Okay. And so when she is finished, he says, and this is your opinion of me. This is the estimation in which you hold me. I thank you for explaining it so fully. My faults, according to this explanation, are heavy indeed. But perhaps these offenses might have been overlooked had not your pride been hurt by my honest confession of the scruples that had long prevented my forming any serious design. So basically what he's coming back at her is, my faults, okay, I get this, but maybe what got triggered, okay, let's use a modern word for this, but maybe what got triggered in you was my being so honest about the argument against asking your hand in marriage. So he stayed with that same idea. She started with, did you confess your feelings and, set up this thing, all the reasons you shouldn't marry me as a defense in a way to ease your blow should I reject you. And he's now coming back with like, no, there are very real arguments against marrying you. I mean, he's owning it. No, there are very real arguments against marrying you, and perhaps those arguments hurt your pride, and those arguments are part of my honest confession. This is me. I am honest. Okay, and maybe that that confession that had gone into my serious thought about asking your hand in marriage, maybe that hurt you. And this again is another Aquarian thing. Aquarians are committed to honesty, okay, to everything. They will be honest about everything that goes into a decision or goes into thinking about a relationship or an argument or discussion. Aquarians really don't like to fight. They like to have very long debates and conversations where things are notarized almost in terms of like where the offenses were and where the difficulties were and things along those lines. So his response to her is like, maybe your pride was offended by my being so honest about my thought process, the process I was going through in asking for your hand in marriage. These bitter accusations, your bitter accusations, your bitter accusations, Elizabeth, these bitter accusations might have been suppressed had I with greater policy concealed my struggles and flattered you into the belief of my being impelled by unqualified, unalloyed inclination, by reason, by reflection, by everything. In other words, what was I supposed to do? Not tell you the truth, not tell you what was going on in my mind, and perhaps, well, I don't know, Elizabeth, maybe it would have been better had I not told you what my process was about asking for your hand in marriage. Maybe you would have preferred that. So he says, these bitter accusations might have been suppressed had I with greater policy concealed my struggles and flattered you into the belief of my being impelled by unqualified, unalloyed inclination, by reason, by reflection, by everything. But disguise, this is the Aquarius, but disguise, this is the Saturn in Aquarius, but disguise of every sort is my abhorrence. Think about that. But disguise of every sort is my abhorrence. Nor am I ashamed of the feelings I related. They were natural and just. Could you expect me to rejoice in the inferiority of your connections, to congratulate myself on the hopes of relations whose condition in life is so decidedly beneath my own. This is an extraordinary thing. I mean, it's something that doesn't really come out in the films much, but he's saying, you can't have it both ways. I don't want it both ways. I'm choosing you for my spouse. I thought you were a companion, a spouse who would understand honesty and sheer transparency. This is very Aquarius here in all things. And part of what we're dealing with here, Elizabeth, is the difference in social class. You know, was I supposed to like lie and tell you that that was not a consideration? Was I supposed to disguise this? Well, what you will know from me is that I will never disguise from you the truth. I will always tell you the truth. And for most people who are kind of like, well, it's not really that romantic. It's a hard truth, but it is an earnest truth, this truth of their social differences and what the repercussions of that will be. And so he's not going to be this condescending patrician husband. He's going to be completely transparent and honest with her in all ways, because what he's seeking in that Venus and Saturn conjunction in Aquarius way, what he is seeking is a true equal, a true companion, even though financially they're not coming from equal places. But then he says to her, was I supposed to rejoice in the inferiority of your connections? Am I supposed to rejoice in the fact that you're hanging out with lowlife? You know, that basically the people you're friends with are of like little or no means. Am I supposed to celebrate this? To congratulate myself on the hope of relations whose condition in life is so decidedly beneath me? You're coming from a family of all girls in which you have to marry, and everything your father worked for can come to nothing. I'm supposed to rejoice and say that this is a wonderful thing. So he's being equally brutally honest in all of this. Some might say it's anger, but there's also, I hope you sort of appreciate what I'm trying to describe here. There's an absolute truth and honesty to the Aquarian thinking here. Elizabeth, trying to maintain her composure, comes back. You are mistaken, Mr. Darcy, if you suppose that the mode of your declaration affected me in any other way. Then, okay, you are mistaken, Mr. Darcy, if you suppose that the mode of your declaration affected me in any other way than as it spared me the concern which I might have felt in refusing you, had you behaved in a more gentlemanlike manner. Okay, so you are mistaken, Mr. Darcy, if you suppose that the mode of your declaration affected me in any other way than as it spared me the concern which I might have felt in refusing you, had you behaved in a more gentlemanlike manner. So in other words, you're mistaken, but you have spared me feeling guilty or bad in refusing you. And this has been made even more strongly by the fact that you are not a gentleman, which is what she is saying to him. You know, you're telling me all these things, you're acting as if I should be grateful, but what about this is gentlemanly? And so you are not the gentleman that I thought you were. And so I'm not going to feel guilty or bad about refusing you. She saw him start because she's gotten him at his Saturn Aquarius core, okay, which is the gentleman. This is the thing about Venus and Saturn together in a sign. They can push each other's buttons like nobody's business, okay? So she said, you are not a gentleman. You don't behave in a gentlemanly fashion. So she's kind of saying it's not so much about truth as it is about being a gentleman, which you profess to be. She saw him start, but he said nothing, and she continued, you could not have made me the offer of your hand in any possible way that would have tempted me to accept it. Again, his astonishment was obvious, and he looked at her with an expression of mingled incredulity, like disbelief, and mortification, embarrassment. She went on. From the very beginning, From the first moment, I may almost say, of my acquaintance with you, your manners impressing me with the fullest belief of your arrogance, your conceit, and your selfish disdain of others, were such to form that groundwork of disapprobation on which succeeding events have built so immovable a dislike. And I had not known you a month before I felt that you were the last man in the world whom I could be prevailed upon to marry. Boom, boom, boom. Okay, she just gives it to him right there. Okay. And so Darcy, I mean, it's like a kick to the, okay, so Darcy says, you have said quite enough, madam. I perfectly comprehend your feelings and have now only to be ashamed of what my own have been. Forgive me for having taken up so much of your time, and accept my best wishes for your health and happiness. And so he departs. It's an extraordinary scene. I love this scene between the two of them, because they're not yet lovers, but they are lovers. You know, they are talking to each other. You know, it first comes across as insults, but actually they are talking to each other about their relationship and about how each person sees the other person here. And they're talking about transparency and they're talking about honesty. What I also sort of want to underline here is that all relationships have one fight. All relationships have one fight that no matter how short or long that you are together, you will return to again and again and again. And it's not a fight over something. It's not a fight over kids. It's not a fight over money. It's not a fight over sex or love or fidelity or whatever. It's this one fight. And it's based on a conversation that I just shared with you. It's that conversation, usually pretty much early on in the relationship. It might actually be the first fight, okay, or one of the early fights. And it just becomes a trigger to the two people involved, and you will come back to this again and again and again and again and again. And you can see that this is going to be the one fight that Elizabeth and Darcy return to consistently over and over again in their relationship. So basically the scene ends with, you know, Elizabeth Darcy is, you know, he departs. She's very upset. She's actually collapses on the floor and cries for about a half an hour. Because she's so full of all these different emotions that he spoke to her that way, that she spoke to him that way, that there was this intimacy between the two of them, you know, in the way that they really, really regarded each other. I mean, until then, they've been surrounded by people, friends, you know, someone in the drawing room, whatever. So there's this intimacy between the two of them. And there is this connection that she doesn't know what to do with. But the thing that is so Venus and Aquarius is that she is astonished that he had had feelings for her all along. Okay, this is the thing that Venus in Aquarius, or Venus in the air signs, they're always kind of like the last ones to find out that someone had feelings for you. Okay, it's kind of like, you know, there's always this kind of disconnect and like, oh, they had feelings, you know, and then it sort of floods in with all of these feelings. Okay, so it's not like, oh, they had feelings, that's great. It's like, oh, they had feelings, and then all of a sudden what's unlocked are all of these emotions and all of these feelings. And they're so stressed out. They're so in complete contradiction. She feels bad for her sister. She feels bad for Wickham, but she's also beginning to recognize that maybe in some ways her sister and Wickham disguised her own feelings of what was going on underneath. The scene is very quickly followed by a letter that Darcy delivers to her the next day, and then he leaves just as quickly, in which he takes responsibility for breaking up the crush between Elizabeth's sister and his best friend, simply because he didn't think that they were serious. And he kind of apologizes for that, but he also points out that he doesn't think that Bingley would have been as able to deal with the ramifications of making a social decision like that, and probably would have been forced to break Jane's heart anyway because of social pressure. And then he reveals the entire sordid history of Wickham. And this is the thing that sort of like enlightens Elizabeth, and she changes her mind And in true Venus and Aquarius fashion, by changing her mind, she changes her feelings about Darcy as well. Darcy then goes on this kind of making it up to Elizabeth. Elizabeth's sister runs away with Wickham and elopes, and and he's a total cat or whatever. Darcy goes and finds him and pays him off without telling anyone, but Elizabeth discovers that's what it was. Darcy goes and reunites his friend with Jane and promises not to interfere, and so they come together and they're going to be happily married, probably because they're not really that deep. Jane Austen doesn't really spend a lot of emotional time with Jane and Bingley, but she spends it with Elizabeth and she spends it with Darcy. That's why they're the compelling lead characters of this story. And what they really stand for is marriage. It's a Venus-Saturn conjunction in an air sign. That's a marriage aspect. What they stand for is marriage, but also going into marriage without being driven by passion, without being driven by sentimentality, without being ignorant of who the other person is, but entering into a contract, a marriage, and even defying society. When Elizabeth tours Pemberley, she's told by the servants that he's a very generous master and he's good to the servants and he works with them or whatever. So there's a kind of like egalitarian communist side to Darcy. He's what they called in the 18th century a benevolent tyrant. He's benevolent in his prosperity, but he takes seriously the responsibility of being lord of the manor and the people who are underneath him. And as part of that, he's taken seriously the responsibility of choosing who his lady will be, but he has chosen a lady who is his equal, if not in some ways maybe his superior, in terms of mind and even of character. She has educated him in how to be a better man and how to be a husband, in the same way that he has also educated her to take away these things that you might tell yourself that you need to hear to be romantic, and this is the true proposal that I'm giving to you of being my companion in life. And she has to see that. She does see that. She wants it, but she might not have always wanted it. And in the course of the second part of the novel, she comes to really understand his point of view, understand who he is as a man, and to understand his character. And she also applauds him when he comes through in these gentlemanly adventures of restoring the love between her sister and his friend, and taking care of the elopement problem when Lydia, Elizabeth's sister, runs off with that cad, and so he takes care of it. So I wanted to end on this. And of course, the novel ends in October again. It's 1 year, almost exactly to the day. So we're back in the season of Venus again, where when the novel ends, where he after a couple of more social complications or judgments or whatever, he finally, because he's been holding back his feelings, but his feelings have never changed. But he's watched her enlightenment. He's watched her understand him and understand herself and also understand them. He's watched her kind of take her focus away from the group of people or fighting the injustices done to others and put the focus on herself and on him, and he's warmed by that. This is the conviction that he can now propose to her again. And clearly he was afraid proposing the first time. That's why he armored himself, but that he can propose to her again and really show his heart, and that he can really show his heart, and that he can really show his soul, that he can bear it all to her, with the hope that the proposal will be accepted. And for a man to come back and propose after that devastating rejection, that's saying a lot for Darcy as well. And so here we are back again in October, and he's feeling more the comfort, and he can feel that she's going to say yes, and we all know that she's going to say yes, and of course she says yes. She becomes Mrs. Darcy, but But the wonderful thing about a Saturnian relationship is that it doesn't really begin with passion. It doesn't begin with sentimentality. It doesn't begin with showing one's feelings openly. It actually begins very reserved, fear of rejection, cautious, testing the other person. This is the thing that Saturn relationships begin. And, you know, when people have Saturn in their chart, it's very important to understand how you test. Okay. A lot of times the focus can be on fear of rejection, but you need to spend a lot of time on understanding how you test, because if Saturn is too strong in your chart and it's not connected to your chart, you can test without knowing what the answers are. So someone might, you know, answer, and then you start a new series of tests. So if you have strong Saturn in your chart and you feel like your heart is cold or distant or, you know, on guard, right? Because that's why it is in some way. Remember, you know, that you're testing, that's okay, but you want the person to pass the test at the same time. So you just don't want to be leveling one obstacle after the next, after the next. So again, Venus in Aquarius, Saturn in Aquarius, they can sort of be the last to really understand their feelings and the power of their feelings, or that they had, if they had ever even had these feelings. You know, it takes them a while to sort of connect the feelings to where the mind is. And so it's this lovely part. It's near the end of the novel, and I'm sure some of you will be familiar with it. It's a lovely exchange. She turns to Darcy and she says, "How could you begin?" Okay, she's basically asking, when did you first fall in love with me? You know, we all do that with people that we fall in love with. We ask, when did you first fall in love with me? When did you first know? You know, and a lot of times people will say it was love at first sight, the instant, you know, whatever, but this is Saturn, okay? You don't know right away. So she says, how could you begin? When did you first know that you fell in love with me? I can comprehend, remember, I can comprehend your going on charmingly when you had once made a beginning, but what could set you off in the first place? And he answers to her, you know, question, when did you first fall in love with me? He answers, I cannot fix on the hour or the spot or the look or the words which laid the foundation. It is too long ago. I was in the middle before I knew what I had begun. And I think that's such a lovely, lovely sentiment about love. And it's so Saturnian. I was in the middle before I knew what I had begun.